Welcome to the LawFi DAO third workshop in the Digital Organisation Design Series facilitated by Multilateral Group. We have Duncan, Andrew, Will and Grant here representing Multilateral, so thank you again. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we all meet today and extend our respect to elders past, present and emerging. The land was never ceded. So also, if you have any issues with the recording being seen or heard now or subsequently, please send an email to jp@lawfidao.com and we'll be sure to edit out those references. But we've got a big program ahead of us for our last session, and I'll hand over to the Multilateral team to kick us off. Over to you.
Cool. So, hi, everybody. We're going to start with just running through the post-workshop assignment review from last week, which was starting to get some high-level understandings of member classes that would be applicable to LawFi DAO, and starting to look at drafting out some initial thoughts from the group in terms of rights and themes, rights and benefits, obligations, liabilities, and looking at collating the themes that are common themes that come through from the group. So that's work in progress, and we'll pick that up offline as well in terms of putting that together. Then we're going to work through the member class functionality, which Duncan will take the lead on the majority of that, and we'll start to drill down a little bit on some of the component parts that make up that functionality around T's and C's, contracts, what sort of service scopes we need to look at, the delivery thereof, and also start breaking down some of the authorities and delegations and identities and accountabilities, some of which are all areas that are, from the feedback we're seeing at the moment, are concerns from regulators as to how these sorts of things will be dealt with. So we'll work through some of our solution thoughts there. And then also the member rights, benefits and obligations, as we just said. Then we're going to take you through the dynamic attribution and allocation system and how that works and how that can work for LawFi DAO. That'll be an important section because it really starts setting up what the incentive model looks like to take the group and the participants, both in this workshop but also post-workshops, in building out the fourth item on the agenda, which is the blueprint skeleton. So working on the components, answering obvious questions and model feedback, etc., from everybody. But then that sets the tone for what's next. What these workshops have been, by the time we get to the end of today, is really an introduction to how to go about setting up the fit and the structural substance behind making what we want to be a very successful DAO going forward. So we'll be making a call for participants to contribute, both in terms of the design, the content and the implementation plan, and all of that over the course of the next period of time will culminate in us being able to go back and take a member vote. So there's some of the things ahead of us today, but I think let's kick off with Duncan. You might like to lead the member class components. Yep. And take questions from the group, and then roll straight into the functionality components.
Yep. Well, we did issue for review the 5 member class names that we came up with, and then we added later, sort of post discussion and vibe of the workshop. We added the apprentice and the designers as a member class that should be considered, thinking its rights and obligations. So first of all, I'll just start off. Has anyone, have we missed something? Would anyone like an explanation on one of those? Yes.
Forgive me, just by way of clarification, can each member class be split into subclasses? And the reason I ask that is because in the investor class, we may want to treat advisors as in on par to investors, because advisors typically get token allocation as if they were an investor. So that was my first one. Yeah.
Here's the delineation. Member classes is all about rights and obligations. It's the enforceability is achieved by member class allocation. The transaction activity, including tokens, can be influenced by member class, but is probably more influenced by the transaction engine and the mechanisms there, which is the service definitions, because they're the things that actually identify and target when tokens get changed. And when we talk about DAS, which is another view of looking at benefit, then we do the third class, which is pure benefit. And we finished off with a discussion at the end of last workshop, we'll define benefit. Or what I wanted you to do is don't be constrained by thinking current benefit categories. Let's think, let's be open to what a benefit is. So I wouldn't want subclasses, because a member class is basically, it's also, if it's a member class that provides services, I know that all the stakeholders all the members who have achieved that member class have passed at the prescribed qualification and evidenced qualification to be able to meet the obligations of that member class. So you don't want to do, and then there's sub bits, that's all. If there's different rights and obligations, we just roll up a new member class. Embrace the select. I think now it would be good to try and limit the member classes, because we haven't got the fully functional digital system. But once you've got a fully functional digital system, why be limited? There's your scalability.
Yeah, so we'll just focus on the core member classes, even though we can add bells and whistles later. Yeah. And then the other one was, just for clarification, is designers also, does that mean the developers of the protocol?
I think it's this was more of a collective. It can include the developers, but aren't we designing stuff as well? It's really also recognition of the founding group.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll just put a placeholder there for maybe a separate class again for developers, given that developer liability in relation to open source protocols is a very hot topic.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so I think there's several levels of design. There's conceptual design, technical design. I put technical design in with the build of the product, not, it's part of, here's the requirements. But design sits both sides of the requirement definition. There's the conceptual design. How will the bouncing balls connect? And then there's the technical. So yes, it'd probably be worthwhile having another group of developers. Come on, there's got to be more than one. And I talked to Joni earlier in the week. She does have the advantage of getting some extra time with us, but there you go.
So Duncan, I suppose I'm happy to chip in and tell me to shut up. Anyone can tell me to do that anytime. I'm used to it. But in all seriousness, the insurance view that I'm primarily bringing that lens to these kind of discussions. I think I made the points last time that we have to lock something down until we can really understand, how they're likely to respond to it. And I think these discussions are really important. And I think, as we talked about last time, the positioning, how they're described and how they're understood and how clear they are, will make it easier to take forward to the insurance market when it's required. So, look, I guess from a design point of view, I've got these thoughts, but I'm not the lawyer. I'm not the governance person. I don't understand all these other requirements. So I'm kind of reluctant to chime in too much on that side of it, because I don't know what the members really are going to want. And it sort of goes back to that class discussion about what the different class rights were as far as votes and obligations and how that might be seen. And I'm not saying this just because it's the Queensland academic has referred to the religious kind of structures, or a few times, and I've kind of been tossing that over, and I'm not sure, has that sort of gone through the discussion as to the likely suitability of that structure to fit these class of members, or is it kind of not a fit?
I'd say this, it's a possibility. Anything's a possibility, but I'll bring it back to an operational point of view. Faith organisations have huge protection under the current jurisdictional environment as a church, and what we're not dealing with that. We're doing fee for services. So the church can structure itself to have its non-risk areas and have sort of that's probably, if you want to do it, is the impressionist side of a church. You have no liability, you don't have any obligations, but you can come and influence and be wise. Okay, well, that's great, but correct me if I'm wrong, video full of lawyers. Being able to put up your hand and say I'm a church is a fairly significant legal gate to go through.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it was the concepts, and therefore does that translate? And I didn't feel intuitively it did, but I didn't really have a view as to the rest of how it might work, and what you've just said just tends to reinforce what I was kind of thinking, was that it's good to have as background, but it's probably not.
The thing is, I look at it, and a lot of the rights and obligations are to do with functions, and I'll go back to it, and this is a procurement and ordering concept in my head, which is an operational matter. Surprise, surprise, everyone. If you want to achieve one-click or token exchange procurement of a service, then you've got to have that service defined. Also, the providers of the service have to be under some obligation to the rules of the service delivery mechanism. They're the rights and obligations I need to be attached to the issuer class. Okay. The consumer, if you're a consumer, similar again. I mean, you can't go into an online system and start purchasing for something without agreeing to the terms and conditions of that marketplace. Well, we're trying to establish the equivalent in a DAO, and we're doing this with stakeholder groups and specialized rights and obligations to enable then use of a token or one-click procurement, as well as all the other rights, as well as the voting rights, as well as the incentive rights. I mean, we got to take the blinker off and think really laterally for the operational efficiency.
Multilaterally, even.
Yes, I was corrected last time. Thank you very much. Yes, William. Well picked up, Alex. You get nothing. I was going to give, but yeah. So it's think laterally, people. In terms of if you've got all the things, if you've got a whole lot of things agreed to prior to actually making an order or making a decision, the automation is in the preparation, not at the time of decision. Well, stunned silence greets me. Let's just go into, is everyone clear what they're about? then it's going to be an exercise outside of this workshop to actually drill down with the people who want to have the legal representation to actually start constructing it. The way I described this to Joni earlier is this is a master services agreement construct where we're really setting up a deed and then that engagement then the order mechanism. And what we're wanting to try and do is have categories of delivery within the master services agreement, and therefore not everyone is obligated to all the conditions, only the things that relate to them. So I think that's an exercise outside of that. Service scope and delivery. Service definitions. Now, this gets down, Andrew, to some of our discussions on prioritisation too, but service delivery here is some fundamental decisions need to be made. Are we selling, is it a business to consumer mandate? Are we selling to the public, i.e. non-members? Yes or no? If not, then things are a little bit easier because we've got membership onboarding and we can have default T's and C's as part of that onboarding. If we're issuing to a public, then we're in a regulated environment where we basically have to provide at the point of purchase all the information we are obliged to provide, so the member of the public can pick it up. See, we can shortcut that if we make them members. It's just a thought. It's a consideration.
And I'll just add to this. Forgive me. That in the DAO model law, the approach is that if somebody becomes a member without their knowing it, so maybe they've bought a pay-to-rely product, actually the sort of bylaws of the DAO should say that a person doesn't become an actual member until they've participated and sort of confirmed their membership by participating in some sort of governance behavior or other sort of operational behavior. So it's a latent thing until the person actively engages, so
But
as not to spread liability.
Yeah, no, it's very similar to cooperative law, which is the same. You have to have active participation in the purpose in that situation. Here with the DAO, we want active participation in the governance and or operation. So that's fine. But I'm just saying these are, I mean, all it is we don't want to sell this to anyone. We actually only want to sell this to members, and they have to onboard as a member, acknowledge, we collect evidence and acknowledge that they are a member of the DAO to get access to the services. So it's actually a commercial decision of the DAO.
But does that depend on how you define member and what rights you give a member? We're going a bit of a circle, right? Because I could be a user of the platform and sign some terms and conditions, no doubt, or agree to the smart contract or whatever it is, without being designated a member. But I actually am a member of the community, so it depends what. So, do you want to reserve membership, the term member, for a governance kind of function?
Well, it depends if we can, if I don't think so. I don't want to, but we might be forced to in some jurisdictions based on the upcoming, yet to be done regulation. From an exemplar point of view, when we're talking about regulatory equivalence, absolutely not. We actually want member classes which allow us line of sight between particular regulation and a member class fulfilling that. So the exemplar membership is very much beyond just governance. It's what's needed to create the adapter between our member-based environment and whatever regulated environment by the regulated entities, whatever jurisdiction we're operating in.
Right. So you could have, for example, a member class called user.
Yeah.
Anyone wants to buy or sell on the platform, and they don't necessarily have any other sort of. They've got a right to income, but not a right to vote necessarily.
So yes, I mean, this is the thing. If we're looking at a true rule-based environment, and so you're looking at smarts in the underlying digital, a la smart contract in the underlying digital information, we want to have the rules have to be, well, there can't be any ambiguity in the rules, because remember, everything we do, even in smart contracts, ends up as zeros and ones. So there has to be a algorithm applied, a logic applied, which can be understood, explainability in terms of artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, you know, it's my favorite saying from my tech days, which was, hang on, but you do realize this is zeros and ones, and it goes through chips and chips, all chips, conditional chips. I mean, it's all just electricity at the end of the day. So it's got to be logical. We can't have uncertainty.
I would just add that it's important, I think, to have the users or the consumers as a member class, because to serve their interests, for any model of governance, we would want to make sure that as a class, they have a voice, and even as an elected representative, there's someone there that represents what the user or the consumer perspective is. So I think I lean towards them being a member, but yeah,
Well,
in terms of
certainly want to replicate an attraction mechanism, a customer journey coming on board. There's people who want to dip their toes into the lake before they jump in, which means we want a member class so they can observe. You know, and maybe the governance membership is if you don't observe more than X number of times a year, because we've got an audit trail of that, you know, you have to come in again, or not even that, we don't care. Because what you want to do is that soft landing into okay, now you're signing up, now you're committing to something, because you can't just, if you want to sit there and observe, it's them seats at the back. If you want to influence, then you got to start coming up to the front. All right, well, what I can say about the services offered, and this is certainly in going forward, the service definitions and how they're delivered, depending on the member classes, will be actually a big part of the blueprint, because that's your transaction capabilities. You're actually describing and categorizing the digital transactions on top of the tokens. Okay, tokens write to a ledger. The ledger is just an index to a record. We still have to keep the records. So in developing a digital organization, the token is just the index to your record environment. And so we've got to think about, when we talk about operational mechanisms, it's not just the tokens that we look at and how we use them. It's also the other systems and capabilities needed to be developed, particularly to satisfy the evidentiary load of requirements. Authorities and delegations. Has everyone got a clear idea of, I mean, it's the only thing I say that everyone's familiar with it. It says as a management consultant of more years than I'd care to own up to, one of the first things I always ask is, can I see your authority delegations register? And it's not over 50% that I get a yes. It surprisingly missing in even large organizations. But once again, in a digital organization, you want to know who in the organization, so the example is Multilateral is represented in LawFi DAO by Andrew. That was actually a intended delegation by us to him to represent the collective four of us. Well, we need that, because if Multilateral is going to commit to something, then LawFi DAO has to have a line of sight that Andrew is actually an authorised officer in some capacity. Now, We've given it to him. He also happens to be a director of Multilateral. So in that role, Andrew, not as our representative of the DAO, but Andrew as a company director for Multilateral, can also commit Multilateral to things that in a format that is acceptable to Australian corporate law. So it's actually understanding under what powers or what authority or what capability that rests in the individual that we get our true line of sight and actual governance capability. But if we have that, then the system stops approvals by people who do not have the authority to do so. So just recently, because I've just stood up a proprietary limited company and I've just distributed to the board members today, I have used our authorities delegation prototype to actually define manually the approvals that have been given to the directors, and I'm a director, and as well as given to me, I'm the chief operating officer. So I actually distinguish the authorities between the hats because I don't want to be COO for much longer. So I've got to hand it on. But that's the capability we need to have. When I hand the COO hat on to another person, then the system needs to know, oh, it's Joni. Joni's now the COO. And anything which is authorised for a COO or needs a COO of authorisation, her approval will now do it. So that's what we're talking about in terms of this. Has anyone got more questions on that? Because I'm running out of time and I think we can probably keep on going forward. Andrew, have you got anything to add? Would you like to circle round again?
Well, I would add that the interesting thing about an authorities and delegations register in a digital context would be that you could create rules whereby you cannot, a member or a participant cannot forego a defined delegation of power until there is someone else already in place to take up that, so that there would be no gaps. That is now possible in digital.
Well, there is, though. In designing it interesting, I have got included in the design that condition, because what if the person, sorry, this is a bit macabre, what if the person falls dead? What happens then? We haven't got someone set up. So yes, you're right. There's the continuance of authorization. You can time it, you can timestamp it, you can actually say, actually, I'm delegating my authority to join in for 24 hours, starting at 11:59 tonight.
Well, you could have contingencies preset in the situation, so that if I was to drop dead, it automatically goes to someone who's been
yes, there's the will. This is the thing when you're defining. See, this is the interesting thing. Sorry, details. When you're defining, you're doing the requirements and the definition for a system. One of the flags or one of the configurable items, can the delegation be inherited? Now, if it's not inherited, which means I've delegated you, Will, but I haven't given you the ability to delegate. All right. So you have no inheritance capability. I can also delegate authority to you and pass on my delegation, so long as I've actually got the authority to delegate my delegation. So there's a complex web that you have to configure, have all the configurable items set up and switches ready to go to be able to do this.
What I'd add to this is the conversation we're having at the moment is very relevant to when you look at it in the context of something like the Digital Regulation and Cooperation Forum Insight paper on Web3 that has just come out in the last couple of weeks over in the UK. Now, the DRCF is effectively the body that brings together four of the key regulators in the UK across areas like competition and markets, communications, IT and financial conduct. So it covers all four key regulators, and what they've addressed when it comes to DAOs in terms of insights is they're looking at where their concerns sit in terms of the ability to take on these areas of how can they pin something against someone or some entity for decisions made. And it comes very much to what we've been talking about here about looking at delegations and authorities and setting up a key line of sight that addresses some of these issues. So I'll dig out the link to that site and I'll pop it in the chat for people to have a look at in their own time. But it's very, very relevant right now.
I think I'll just pick on a few people now. Greg, I'm going to pick on you first. The if you and Dacom were a member of LawFi DAO, as an investor, what benefits would you hope to see, and and what obligations do you think should be associated with that? Should you have a limitation of liability if you're just providing capital and not sort of helping with the business side of or operational side of things? What do you think?
Yeah, if it's a purely funding contribution. I step back and look at it. There's sort of three things that are happening. There's the users, there's the governance, and there's like contributors to the operation. That's how I see conceptualize it for myself. And not all of them want to vote on everything or participate in everything. So I think there's almost like the contributors to the DAO could be employees or contractors or service providers or people offering loans or funding or this sort of thing. And it comes to be more a contractual relationship with the DAO. Now, the details of what every contract looks like for each of those different streams, I don't know. But as a pure funder, I'd expect you just have some sort of commercial return arrangement, whether it's interest-based or revenue-based on the two. But I wouldn't expect that as a funding person, you'd actually have any obligations beyond providing the funding.
Yeah, got it. And I'm going to now pick on Greg Oakford for the Picking on Greg series of this workshop. Greg, let's just say that you're a member in the consumer class. So you're looking at the pay to rely products, and I don't know, you've maybe used a few products across different lawyers. So one from Bedazzle, maybe one from Law Firm 2, one from Law Firm 3, and you've identified that all of them could be improved if they had combined, like if they were using the peer review function, whereas each of them were just providing their individual advice. That's just one scenario, but if you put your shoes yourself in the position of one of the people relying on this product, in what ways would you want to give that feedback, or might you be hesitant to pay to rely? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, a lot of this stuff around, it's not really my area of expertise in terms of some of the stuff you guys are chopping up, to be perfectly honest. But, I don't know, like, I think you originally asked me about liability as a consumer. Is that right? Like, I would be very hesitant if I'm a consumer. I mean, I was hesitant just to join this DAO, as you know, Joni, because I just don't know enough about DAOs. I'm not a lawyer. I don't come from that field. I don't spend my time looking at 50-page reports. Unfortunately, I know you guys can digest those pretty well, but I'm a content creator from probably more of an audio visual social media perspective. So I would have a lot of hesitation as a consumer if I was somehow entangled into some type of legalities that I should say involve a DAO. Like, I don't know. That would be my take.
it's a realistic take, and it sort of tells me that with the consumer member class, then we either say you're not a member just by virtue of providing those products or using those products, or back to what I said originally, that you're not a member unless you activate or actively choose to be involved in governance because you've, say, bought 3 of the pay to rely products. So it seems to be consistent with your feedback.
Would someone have to, I mean, you're potentially going to get a lot of people that are anons, right? Like, is that going to be allowable? I don't know if that's been discussed before or not, but is that
there's two things to respond to that. The straight answer is yes. Pseudonyms is a crucial part of Web3, but I'll put it to this. Multilateral Group is a pseudonym for 4 individuals, is it not? We like to present ourselves as a collective set of capabilities. So even in a business sense, we've got to handle pseudonyms. Now, the only thing is if we are required by regulation to money laundering or know your customer, we can do that. Then it's a once again a parameter setting, whether it's just the pseudonym which is available to the rest of the membership or the world, or it's your choice. Now, how do you want to be known by your pseudonym? But inside the DAO, inside the ecosystem, if you're in a member class which is transacting in such a manner that regulated data needs to be collected, well, it needs to be collected. End of story.
All right, and Alana, I'm gonna try and pick on you, but let me know in the chat.
I'll pick on Led. I think the other thing I was going to say is user class. What are loyalty programs? But just a form of user member class. You don't, the only liabilities you come up there is you got to follow these bouncing balls to get the royalty points. I mean, that's member. And that isn't that parting, you're providing feedback. So once again, can't governance be the opportunity to provide feedback?
Well, I think that's probably into the impressionist class. So you want to make an impression, but that's it. And you're not really sure what will be done with it, but you're happy to take the 1 minute or maybe more to give your feedback. And it may mean that you stay along to see how it's dealt with, and that might allow you to continue to use the pay to rely products or be further involved with LawFi DAO. Or it can just mean that we'll part ways and not have anything to do with each other again, but they've still had an impression on the direction of the DAO, and with no obligation to follow up after making that impression. But I think that's probably my inclination on where it falls in putting it on par to a loyalty program. So yeah, Alana, I don't know if you are in a position to speak, but as a potential lawyer and law firm that could provide pay to rely products, what would mean you're hesitant to come on board as that class of member, as an issuer, that's as it's been described in the table? Or any other category. Don't let me define you.
Well, not so much in terms of the category, but I think it highlights something that Greg O mentioned as well, and that in terms of my obligations as a lawyer, what really I can and can't be doing. So I think we sort of have to look back on the Law Institute's rules around providing legal advice and how I might be restricted in that way. Even simple process-based aspects of giving legal advice. How do we provide fee estimates? Who decides those? The nature of the advice we give. All those kind of considerations from the perspective of what are our compliance obligations as lawyers, I think really have to be looked at, and perhaps they're ones that we should probably look at sooner rather than later, just because it would be a pain to kind of set up a whole process and then know that it's not actually something or a way in which we can deliver. So So that's my thoughts in terms of lawyers and our obligations. In terms of these kind of consumer groups. I mean, I'm a lawyer who usually works with people who have never worked with a lawyer before or have very limited knowledge of what it means to provide legal advice and how we might be restrained in doing that as lawyers. So I think it's more of an educational piece as well that we'd have to provide and think about how we can do that in the most effective way. I mean, could we use the DAO structure to kind of rethink how we communicate what we actually do? Just thinking off the top of my head, but I guess I've always got kind of people who are not familiar with getting legal advice on my mind, and how we can make the process easy and not intimidating for them. Maybe that goes for the whole DAO aspect as well. So, if we want to be able to involve people who are not familiar with DAOs but need enough information to make the right decisions about whether it's worth it for them, then how do we actually provide that? Can we use the structure, the DAO structure, in some creative way to do that?
Yeah, I love it. And actually, I don't know if you saw, maybe many of you saw the post a few days ago by the 101 group, and they had launched a Learn to Earn program about a year ago, and they've just came out with an announcement that said, we think the Learn to Earn model will fail, and anything to do with incentives based on earning ERC20 tokens. And based on the research that they've done, and it aligns to what you're saying, Alana, that incentives, not necessarily token incentives, but how this is done in a DAO, it needs to follow these few things. There's individual motivation, and then when the DAO comes in is the interpersonal motivation. So I'm just literally reading off this, I screen capped it, but under the interpersonal motivation, the factors are competition, cooperation, and recognition. And so how we might foster those three elements as what might draw a person to the DAO and keep them in based on the walks of life that they've come from or that they're in at the moment. So I don't know how it relates to ERC20 token incentives, but we can take that offline, Alana, and maybe brainstorm a bit. But that looks to be where it's going.
There's similar designs. This is incentive designing, because at the end of the day, the mechanics of the incentive delivery is different, but it's now digital. So Andrew and I, in one of our cooperatives, which was a car vehicle cooperative, which was registered but never operated, we had the basically excess, and the concept was excess and premiums even were not so much influenced by the typical analytics, but by self-education on driving, including the first thing is learn what to do at an accident, which is by research the area that car insurers are most sort of frustrated at, getting their customers to do what they want them to do. So our concept as a negative, as an incentivification, but do this first, was do this education course, because you do that online education, however long, your excess reduces by a half. Up until then, so incentives can be both carrot and stick. But you're right, it's then getting down to people who actually know about incentive designing, and incentive designing is about as hard as policy designing, let me say. Predicting what's
Alana, I'd like to pick up on I think you've hit a couple of nails on the head, and it's a great segue to one of the topics I wanted to introduce, and I didn't know where in this conversation it would be, but I think now is a good time for it, and that's designing our purpose and breaking down our purpose streams. looking at the white paper as it stands at the moment, and I was talking to Joni earlier in the week and saying in a cooperative, we get to do a purpose that drills down to 10 or 12 words that capture everything you know you want to do and all the stuff you don't know you want to do in the future because you're not allowed to change it. And that's hard, and it takes a long time to get it really drilled down. But if I categorise what our 3 current purpose streams are and ask people to start thinking about how they would consider LawFi DAO prioritise these in terms of how that informs our construct. And I've broken them down into 3. So the first one is the affordable access to commercial digital law and other professional services advice. So that's clearly the pay to rely and other stuff. The second one I've characterised as end-to-end knowledge chain education. And I say end-to-end and I say knowledge chain because at one end we are talking about policymakers, we're talking about legislators, we're talking about regulators. We're also looking at incumbent leadership bodies, we're looking at firms, we're looking at practitioners, and most importantly, we're looking at the next generation professionals, the people that are still at high school, still coming through uni and are just entering practice at the present time and have got their trainer wheels on. And that's a big classification and a very broad remit in education for us to have to think about how we deal with that. But it's also got a big long-term game on it too. So interesting one there. And then the third one is looking at this global leadership question and saying, well, what are our views when it comes to, do we want to establish and use a formalised standards so that we can demonstrate self-regulation, etc., and look at that as a best practice model. So they're 3 interrelated things, but they are all quite different in their own way. So it adds lots to think about in terms of how we may want to take that and what implications that has on structure and design, etc., etc. I open that up to the group for comment and discussion. And you can take it off on notice too and come back later if you want as well.
Well, maybe the hard question is, should we just focus on one? Or does one need the other 2 to be effective? Or, you know, could the other 2 be done by different organizations in different structures?
Or could they be done over time? So you focus on one and then a few years later focus on another.
Letting the cat out of the bag, we think there are dependencies amongst the 3.
Yeah. Oh, this goes back to I think to the question I was asking you, Joni, on a previous one of these, like why we're here. And I think my takeaway from what you said is you want to deliver pay to rely via a digital platform. Like, so there was at least 2 of those items there. Like, you could go off and do this yourself. You could set up a company to do this, but the idea was actually to try it on a digital platform. So it's the digital delivery of accessible legal services is how I paraphrase it. And then a byproduct of that, we can train and educate and that sort of thing, but the actual thing is to get this up and running.
Well, that's the challenge, because the purpose could just be a digital delivery model, but then that's got much more of a for-profit slant, but wrapping the other purposes around it blurs that there's significant not-for-profit elements to undertaking that, even that for-profit exercise, if you look at it in isolation. And if we were to just do all of these things under one DAO, yeah, is that actually a risk or an exposure to risk of doing many different things that our members are comfortable with? And I think the resounding answer was no at our last AGM. So we have to break off some elements. Because do we want to just focus on the not-for-profit stuff?
Yeah. Or or the other way to do it is, because remember, my basis is always embrace the complexity rather than trying to deal with it structurally, because I think that's the easy way. I think if you timeline it, and you actually, what we've recently talked about in one of the organisations, let's draw up, forecast a life cycle, and what are the conditions that you would kick off, you know, the profit. If you start in a non-for-profit and you get to a level of capability where now you can monetize the effort up to now and make it a for-profit, then at that point you can make a decision, because that's a forking or a sub down that can be actually written into the rules, that if it what do members get if there's a fork. It's just part of the upfront definition.
I like that. It doesn't have to be about profit, right? I think, well, I'm not on this call for a profit. I'm on this because it's an interesting exercise. So I'm quite happy with that, but that depends on the other participants. But taking away that profit driver, I think, is helpful at this stage.
Yeah, but bringing that back down to how do we raise capital, it basically, I think, means a debt instrument where any returns made from switching on the platform are made by way of interest repayments and not any dividend-like return. But each issuer still gets their revenue through engaging with the pay-to-rely model, but there's no platform revenue, so to speak, unless we also switch on the insurance pool, and it's not a form of revenue, it's just a form of reserve, which could be subject to tax. So yeah, we get back into structuring.
Well, but that's the regulator adapter, because if we set it up and then say at some stage, because what's a not-for-profit? It's not a not-for-profit, it's not for loss, and what it really is, and is not for distribution. So what's the difference? It's what you do at the tail end of the process. And once again, it's a configuration. You know, you go left instead of right or straight ahead. So from a digital perspective, you know, it's just a configurable element. And but we need to understand during the blueprint development, have you got a fee for service somewhere in your future? Is it a possibility? Is it a potential? Because we want to make sure we include all the fundamental elements that will allow that to be turned on without us saying completely re-engineering the environment, which is what you would have to do if you went in a centralized stuff. This is, hey, we're just opening another shop front.
Yeah, well, it's a controversial topic whether any DAO turns on a fee switch to have an actual income stream that goes to the DAO and not necessarily is distributed to a portion of token holders or many. So yeah, DAOs, it's a very touchy topic because of the aggressive stance taken by at least the US securities regulators and ASIC with the recent enforcement actions against centralized entities and what is an unregistered versus should have been a registered security or a financial product. So we could have that as a configurable field that a governance model could switch on. But again, in the broad reading of the financial services laws, and this is not advice, if it gives you the option to participate in a financial benefit, then you can still characterize the scheme very broadly as constituting a financial product that is in need of a license. So even just having it as a configurable field does introduce risk.
The other thing to look at it is all you're doing is collecting, you're putting revenue generated funds that would otherwise be distributed is going to be held in escrow to basically pay for any particularly tax liability which the operation of the DAO incurs. So it doesn't have to be it is actually, we can in the Treasury say this money has been withheld for one reason only, and if the money is not needed for that reason, it gets returned to the originated, you know, member designated to.
I think,
We're talking
yeah,
smart contracts now. This is not relying on people remembering this. It's actually laying it out, and it's sitting there, and it will be executed if the conditions are met.
Yeah, and I think the sentiment or the reading that I get from our membership is that pay to rely protocol needs to be experimental only, and not actually pressed, not going live. So it's all dummy revenue, it's all test net, and that is actually the experiment that achieves the other two purposes. And maybe the forecasted timeline is only at which point that we do have DAO recognition, clear licensing regimes for tokens, that our membership base is willing to actually switch on live the ability to use the pay to rely protocol and rely on the revenue and be remunerated for participating in other activities within the DAO. But until then, pay to rely protocol can only ever be on testnet with dummy revenue. That sounds like the compromise that needs to be taken here.
So how would you fund developer costs and all that sort of thing? Is that donations in that model?
Well, it would have to assume donations or a debt funded. So interest returns could be made once regulatory clarity is achieved and the model can be switched on, and people can start using it. But all the meanwhile, the community is built around a testnet product.
Or a future token distribution.
That too.
Yeah. But I agree, I like Duncan's comment earlier about not-for-profit doesn't mean you don't make money.
Yeah.
You've still got to make money. So you're still going to have to charge users or someone to pay costs of operating it. So there will be some fee generation somewhere, and if you're not running on donations.
Yeah, and I always have in the back of my head what Miles said, or brought to our attention, that a not-for-profit purpose is sacrosanct. And if you go from not-for-profit to for-profit, then it becomes very, very grey for the people that have donated, that they don't get a return on their donation. And maybe they never expected that, but it seems unfair for subsequently arriving investors or participants to profit from the benefit of those donors. Or maybe that's what's made explicit up front. This is a donation exercise, and the intention is that people will benefit if they can do so under a regulatory regime.
Yeah, I mean, we see, obviously we're an investment manager, we see a lot of these things where we help fund a project or operation on the basis that in the future, if it is successful, we'll get a certain share or dollars worth of tokens. So maybe that's an option.
Is there a way we could structure it so that the initial structure is a not-for-profit, and then we potentially tack on a commercial arm slash separate entity slash separate kind of related DAO, which if you invest at the early donation phase, you can somehow have some sort of priority entitlement once the commercial arm is tacked on?
Well, I mean, yet to be proven, but we certainly, my belief that with the Exemplar model, we can have a DAO with multiple regulated entities as the adapter to the contemporary, commercial environment. And we do within that's why we got to think hard about the member classes to enable that we can quarantine people away from data and information or influence, so that they can maintain their compliant nature to whatever their own onboarding requirements were. I don't want to do this, or the requirements caused by being a member of a member class, which gives them the capability to operate via a regulated entity. So this gets back to it embrace the complexity of the system. Now, whether it's possible or not, I see that as the experiment. If we're going to do a digital organization, then the high value of a digital organization is the flexibility of reconfigure. Okay, so yes, I'd like to see it very much as start off not for profit, and then it's an adapter. We don't have to redevelop. It's like a different power plug. I mean, that's the only analogy you can. I mean, you've all travelled. We all know there's different plugs. Well, when you take out the Australian adapter and put in the US adapter, your system still works.
I just really want to applaud you, Alana, because you've given me a light bulb moment. That I think distinguishing a donor model first, and there, if and when it's incubated, that there can be some commercial benefit. It splits the focus up, and you can then say, hi, donors, is this an area of innovation that you think should proceed whether or not it can prove it's like true experimentation, and it appeals to the donor's sense of, we need to fund it to allow it to further itself, because this might not go further, but it might spark something else, but it's still helping the innovation. And if it's incubated and it can go further, then almost the DAO can formally be recognized and deployed, and you can proceed with the commercial model, including the DAO's TGE event, token generation event. Sorry, I don't mean to use acronyms. But what about that perspective? Because I think that would appeal to policymakers too, because they are so fearful that anybody can just, with a click of the button, put protocols out in the world and not responsibly. And so what we might see are sandbox environments and incubators anyway, that look into what code is being built before it can actually be released into the world, and available to retail consumers. So I just thank you, Alana. You helped something switch on. So.
Yes, I kind of feel like I'm coming from the sidelines, because a lot of this is sort of, I'm not too familiar with a lot of the corporate stuff. So
no, it's fantastic
from an abstract point of view. But I think from my experiences, you know, because I do a lot with NFTs, and if I think of the way NFT projects are set up, you know, the idea is you buy one, it gives you access to the community, you get certain entitlements, you get priority access to another NFT. So it's sort of, you know, so it sort of all adds on. The more you do, the more you get, and sort of more of a step-by-step process rather than a here's everything in one go. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Right. Joni, it's just doing a time check. We need to talk about DAS. Hand over to you, Duncan, to kick off, and I will add my bit as we go.
You're on mute, Duncan.
First time I've done it this year, I think. I hope. We have said several times during the presentation that you know, there's this magical bucket called DAS, which can solve a lot of problems. But it is a situation where we believe, and we're in the process of prototyping it with contemporary incentive programs. We've designed it's actually a 3-stage or 3-algorithm process. So one of the things to understand is a token allocation is a single algorithm. You get a token, the algorithm of protocol is run, it's done. What we've done is actually a sequence of 3. Now that gives you, and the middle one is a sequence which just basically awards people potential attribution. So the DAS environment is something where we believe we can start upfront defining with a great deal of accuracy exactly how benefit and liability can be planned for in a particular environment. So I think the way, Andrew, my issue is I talk algorithms and the possibility of sequenced algorithms, but I'll hand over to our customer journey person to talk about what that means for the rest of us.
Thanks, Duncan. So let's start with what is DAS. It's called Dynamic Attribution and Allocation System. So it is an anagram of that. But what does that actually mean and why does it exist? Well, it's there as an incentive system for productivity, for innovation and creativity. And one of the areas that was born out of was this concept of a value of an idea and how people hold back from really putting their cards on the table and their valuable contributions to a thing, because they're worried that they're not going to be given due recognition, or somebody's going to stuff them over and they're not going to make the money that they should have made, or any number of different reasons as to why people don't really have a sense of contribution. And so that was one of the pieces that sat behind it. And another was the concept of personal value, and in particular, endeavour value. So endeavour being what you bring as a person through your experience, through your wisdom, through any numbers of areas of training or whatever, and your life experience to a particular situation, and how that can add value to a broader organisation, and how to recognise that. So there were a couple of the broad brush principles that we looked at when we've started working on DAS, which has been a journey of some 3 or 4 years to get us to where we are now. And we are at we can roll it out in a manual paper form at the moment to prove it. And over time, because of the overall levels of complexity that can be involved here, we see this as over time developing into an AI suitable program to be able to maintain people's personal value, if you like. And in the DAO world, we've looked at the fact, well, if DAOs as a new type of entity are really that, why are they any different than before corporates started life hundreds of years ago, or cooperatives years before that? And we thought, well, okay, so we're now at this crossroads where technology makes a whole heap of stuff possible, DAOs being one and DAS being another, as to how that works. And we thought, well, what would a future of work look like for people if, instead of being in the same job for 40 years, which is already redundant, but it wasn't 40 years ago, what about if what they really want to do is allocate their bandwidth to a whole lot of different things? And some of that bandwidth and attention and skill set can be based on very much in a DAO type environment that meets their particular purpose. And you could be a member of a DAO that is there to put food on the table for you. It could be something, a hobby. It could be any number of different things. Some of them could be very long-term gain. But how do you pull together all the different areas of contribution you put into these things, and how do you capture that as something that you can carry forward with you as an asset to yourself, be it a reputational asset or a financial asset? And those were some of the cornerstone elements that came into the being of DAS, if you like. So fundamentally, what it does is it looks at how do we value something? What sort of contributions can you make to, let's call it a project in this particular case, and let's call it the LawFi DAO project, but it could be any number of projects. So what are the contribution categories that you can contribute from? And we've worked up a long list, and we can circulate this afterwards, of some of the different areas that you could contribute at. And some would have more value to the project than others, as you can understand. So there needs to be a weighting system going into how do those contributions relate going forward. If you think of something like a share bonus pool, would be a very simple way of thinking about, well, what do people have to do to get their particular percentage out of a pool? And there we're looking at the benefit side. But the other part of DAS is, for every benefit, we can also have on the other side of ledger whether there's a liability or not, which plays to the insurance component. So depending on what contribution layer you're coming into, what the risk assessments of that are, and what does that correspond to in terms of a liability within the framework, or not. Sometimes there wouldn't be. Sometimes there'd just be a reputation. But of course, you could also have reputational damage. So there's always a positive, negative type thing. So that gives you the broad brush of what do we value, and that's a list of contribution, and we pick and choose. As LawFi DAO, we'd go through and we pick and choose which of those contribution categories are relevant to our needs. The next piece is, what do we measure? And this is what we call the attribution layer. So again, we can do this manually, or we can do this through smart contract, and we can do it with an algorithm to award what will ultimately be a benefit token for certain attributions that you put your contribution to. Now, it's important to say at this point, and we'll circulate some information that gives you more detail on this, but the token at this level doesn't have any intrinsic token value. It is just a unit within a whole. And we can put rules around that, how many tokens there are for a particular area. Let's call it a benefit token, but it could be in other forms as well. And that's setting up, say, it's providing a weighted promised value for doing something, but there needs to be a trigger event for it to actually interact with another algorithm to actually generate that distribution piece, that allocation element, if you like. So if nothing happens, you just sit on this no intrinsic value token, and it means nothing. It sits in your wallet or your profile through your onboarding system, and it goes nowhere. But if in these numbers of DAOs you're working in, one of these projects goes through and it meets the rules and it meets the milestones and sits within the framework of or the boundaries of the smart contract on which it's written, and hits a delivery trigger, then that informs another algorithm that is operated to divvy up the payments, if you like, in a simple sense, and that's actually controlled through the Treasury, and it's paid by the Treasury, and it's based on a smart contract basis. So you can see how going forward, over a period of time, what this gives people the ability to do if they've got their wallet set up and they've got different DAS benefits in terms of attributions against their profile. There's no reason in 10 years' time, when the market evolves and certainty sits in place, et cetera, that why could a worker that today can't go and get a bank loan because they can't demonstrate consistent employment, or whatever reason there might be through the way the world works, they now have something that is evidence, that is based on the blockchain, that is delivering a stream to them that they can demonstrate income and pay tax on that income in their jurisdiction that they operate in, as they would now. And it can create this opportunity to actually use your DAS portfolio, if you like, as a personal asset. And that opens up some very interesting possibilities going down the track. So at a very high level, that's what DAS is. There's a whole lot of operational stuff that sits under the hood, as you would expect, which is why Duncan hasn't spoken through this, because he's got it all laid out in very detailed operational format. It is very much at the stage where it is there to experiment with in a number of different areas, to trial and test and open up the opportunities to automate this going forward. So there you go. Thoughts, comments, questions?
I can jump in again just to kick things off, because one of my initial queries was the benefit tokens, like if we haven't sorted out our tokenomics model, how does that work? But that's not, it's just that unit of measure. So please don't confuse it with that. But once you're doing that and tracking all of the units of activity or of benefits that people are entitled to, the next step is the algorithm that then allocates, the fiat currency or the actual token benefit out. And again, if our DAO doesn't have any fiat money, or we don't have a pre-mined amount of tokens, or we haven't defined on what basis tokens can be mined or emitted based on those benefits accrued, then we fall down flat on the last element of what's required in the DAS. So it still comes back to us to define in what way we will remunerate people for the benefit. And again, the most conservative position would be by way of probably cash bounties rather than anything to do with tokens, as well as applicable terms. But yeah, it's just a perspective. Maybe that won't kick people off, but
that's been constrained by the current. Let's crack it open to the future. Andrew talked about endeavour value. Now, very simply, endeavour value, let's talk some easy endeavour value. Wisdom, experience, and competencies is 3 of them. Wisdom is codified experience. It means I've learnt something from my experience and I've used it to enable me to pass on the lessons learnt from that. Now, if we put them up as value types in a DAS treasury, the fact that I have participated in creating a DAO, if Exemplar DAO gets up and operating, I'm going to put up my hand as my capabilities and competencies and say, hey, I've done this. Not only that, in a DAS environment, I've done it under smart contract where it's actually being recognized because of the conditions met. It was met on time. It was done on budget. It met expectations, whatever we've defined. I actually get some verified experience and wisdom acknowledgement in my DAS treasury account. So we're looking at that as we want it verified CVs, verified LinkedIn, evidence-based LinkedIn. And I'll leave it, I'll be quiet and I'll let you ask some questions, but I'll leave this thought teaser. If I have 2 DAOs who are both operating a DAS environment, we've set up the capability to do interoperability between DAS treasuries, including on interpretations of benefit. So DAO 1 might benefit one thing, DAO 2 not so much, but we have the ability to exchange via a known formula again. This is the sort of lateral thinking you've got to come into that digital world. What can we do? And if we're playing by the same sort of framework, and how can we handshake? Yeah.
it's a difficult concept it's a lot of things to get your head around early. So I wonder if there's a simpler way of saying, what would make you want to contribute to the DAO? As you know, and if somebody else was also building a pay to rely product, what would make you come to this DAO?
I actually think the second one's more important. So please accept, then that's, for me, I'm the engineer part of this equation. I'm trying to get across that we've done enough investigation, interrogation. We've got to the point where we got to actually, the only way we're going to prove this is actually try and make it happen. So that's where we're at. The comment of what Joni just said, which was, okay, can we do a better explanation? Oh, absolutely. You never get engineers to do the explanations. I'm quite happy. I've got a lovely Dilbert cartoon I can show everyone about engineers one day.
Well, that's okay. I think just to summarize, it was really Leah's feedback that based on a familiarity, or sorry, Alana's feedback, forgive me, familiarity with the NFT ecosystem, it's just bite size. And I think that's probably how we need to think about describing any incentives with LawFi DAO, that we might come up with our dream plan, but we just release it bit by bit and focus on a new announcement once a month or once every quarter on a different way of contributing or leveling up in the way that you're already contributing to access those benefits, and follow a bit of the NFT model, which is familiar to both Web3 natives as well as the mainstream that have entered by virtue of these NFTs. So I hear you loud and clear, Alana. And I think that we'll take that feedback on in trying to come up with a design, an initial incentive design. Leah, did you want to add to that?
Somewhat, yes. In one of the other DAOs that I'm involved with, we kind of went through similar exercise, and that's a very different structure. But again, the question of incentivization and contributors and how much people contribute in terms of time versus resources, so such as money, for example. So we kind of went through the same thing, and we are leaning probably towards the token thing, because again, separation of what people actually bring to the table. So some people might, invest the funds, but not contribute as much in terms of their time and effort, etc. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that, if not all DAOs, but I would imagine many tackle that kind of problem in terms of how you actually incentivize people, because there are people who might want to contribute in terms of completing certain tasks, but will not necessarily be rewarded back if they hadn't put in the funds in the first place. So it's a really interesting discussion, I think, and that's split between different types of contributions as well.
And the contribution, we've got a list, it's not the list. And also we're looking at it and saying we don't mind to have a little bit of overlap. I mean, you might want to describe a contribution very broadly, or you might actually want to describe the subcomponents of that contribution as separate contributions. So it really is how do you want to encapsulate those that set of stakeholders and isolate them for a particular algorithm compared to someone else. So it can be as broad or as narrow as you want. I'm just mindful we are coming up very closely. We have not got to the blueprint skeleton. All I was going to do is show everyone a table of contents. So just do that, and then I'll hand over back to Andrew and Joni to close up. We have a lot of material sitting in the background. Some of it's quite deep, some of it's a bit shallow, but we have got this is just, I've got lots of code underneath it, but just quickly, the 5 minutes left, that's the sort of table of contents we've got for a skeleton. And this is then flushed out. So we have the verification use cases, which are used to do road testing and acceptance. We have its operational footprint. So what operational models or model class options you're maybe looking to consider, and understanding, what jurisdictions you want to register in, what jurisdictions the members will be in, the purpose statement, which we talked about today. Then the rights and obligations split into two. There's the core rights and obligations. So they're the rights and obligations of flat membership. Now that can be very light because we might have a non-invasive, membership conditions. You're there as an observer. Or you might have a DAO. So you remember, it's not just LawFi DAO we have to design for, it's everything. Or you might have a DAO which actually has quite restrictive membership conditions. And then you set down, as we've done, you'd start looking at the member classes. The operational model is basically split into functions, accountability scopes, which is what we're talking about, the authority delegations, the service definitions, and exactly what regulated entities you wish to stand up. The integration and completeness, the verification use cases, we have got a work in progress workflow for doing this. And very early on, it identified that the verification use case was something that had to be done up front and then continually re-presented to the blueprint to make sure we're on track. So those are called road tests within the blueprint environment. And then the final thing, once we've got our final draft, that has to be formally accepted. And that acceptance certification needs to be presented to the membership as part of the voting package, to proceed or not. And I'm done.
Thanks, Duncan. Well, and just to answer the question that came through about how much we would expect to raise from a donor class, it would rely on going through what the roadmap is, at least to do a year or two, maybe a 5-year horizon of educational activities and, the activities that fulfill those other two purposes while the pay to rely protocol stays in testnet mode. So some people may be willing to only fund for a 2-year period. Others may be willing to fund for a longer period, but it's not defined. We would still need to do a budget around what is reasonable, and then in terms of how much we could implement would depend on how much was actually raised at a particular time. So lots of contingencies, but we'll take all of the information that we've gained from your great insights and participation over these 3 workshops, and there will be further communications around next steps insofar as the digital organisation design process and a bit of wrap up. You will each receive an email with instructions to claim your POAP for participation. That's likely to come next week. And we will stay tuned on the LawFi DAO socials. So that's the LinkedIn, Twitter, and console, because the community calls will likely kick off again in the next few weeks. So thank you again for your participation. And I'll just hand over to Andrew on behalf of Multilateral Group to say some closing words.
Thanks, Joni. Thank you, everybody who's been here for the grueling workshops of the last 3 weeks. We really do appreciate your attendance and your attention and your feedback. This whole exercise, as you can see, is very much the first steps on bringing corroboration through good design. And really, the next steps will be looking at that call for participation in helping with the design, the blueprint design, content, and implementation. As Joni said, there'll be emails that come out over the next week or so, and really give some thought as to where you would like to get involved. And we'll also discuss offline how DAS might be able to be applied against this very next exercise as an experiment in itself. So I think there's some work we could look at doing there as well. So thanks very much for attending, and we'll see you all in community calls when they resume in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Big clap to Multilateral Group for all the effort and taking us through. Rest up, reflect, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks all. Cheers.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.